So you will clearly, in my experience in owning buildings, a deferred maintenance building will generally cost me at least 50% in my expenses on this sort of yearly basis because I'm making CapEx improvements as I go along. I am Christina Suter, and this is the Real Estate Breakthrough Show, where we talk about the reality of real estate, the mindset you need in order to face the reality of what it is, and tips and tricks to get you moving forward in investing. I am your host, Christina Suter. So I want to talk a little bit about your real estate education. Now, I've been doing a series recently basically on rules of thumb or definitions, and I want to continue that with the rule of thumbs I was taught. Now, this was 35 years ago. This rule of thumb I was taught on how to quickly calculate the net income on a multi-unit. How to quickly calculate net income on a multi-unit. And the advantage of this style of rule of thumb is that you kind of don't really need to know much about the building in order to do this. Now, there are two ways in order to calculate, there are multiple ways in order to calculate net income on a multi-unit. Just so you know, there are several different multi-unit calculators out there, including BiggerPockets has a very good one. So you can use that. I use one that I got from the Unofficial Guide to Investing in Real Estate, co-authored by Marty Stone. That's the one I use as an Excel spreadsheet, which I have used for 35 years. I probably could update my knowledge a little bit after 35 years. Maybe mine's a little old. Maybe BiggerPockets is better. I know Fortune Builders has their own version. Rich Dad has their own version. And other educational systems will have their own version as well. To really fine tune Michael Blanc, to Nighthawk, to really fine tune what you really anticipate the actuals are going to be on the building. Now, when I'm first approaching a building, I want to move a lot faster than actually pulling out a whole calculator. So this rule of thumb hopefully lets you calculate it in a very short period of time. All right, rule of thumb, how to calculate your net income on a multi-unit. First of all, what's a multi-unit? I got the definition from Wikipedia. Maybe Wikipedia isn't necessarily Oxford Dictionary, but hey, it does capture the basic concept. A multifamily residential, otherwise known as a multi-unit in our industry, is a classification of housing, residential housing, where multiple separate housing units for residential inhabitants are contained within one building or several buildings within one complex. Basically, if you want to look at it from the point of view of a commercial lender, it's 5 units or more. Also, all under one APN number, which is a property tax number, 5 units or more, all under one APN number, generally within one complex. So if you had 3 single families sitting on top of one piece of land as an APN, that is not a multi-unit officially because it is 3. But if you had 6 or 2 duplexes all sitting on one APN number, you have yourself a multi-unit. So don't just assume the multi-units are the big fancy guys of 150 units or more, or even 30 units or more. It is anything that is 5 units or above is the definition of a multi-unit. Okay, rule of thumb, very simple rule of thumb that I was taught so that I can do this very quickly. Basically, you take 50% of the income off the top for a version of expenses. 50%. That might seem like a really big number, but let me tell you part of what's in that number. 35% of when you take off 50%, 35% off the top would be for expenses, property tax, insurance, right? You can include property management, cannot include property management, but property tax, insurance, maintenance, gardeners, maintenancing of general association or general space inside of the apartment building, that would be a 35% off the top is going to be expenses set aside for that purpose. Now, 15% off the top are set aside for what are called CapEx. CapEx would be capital improvements. That would be structural improvements, might be a roof, might be a gate, might be foundation, might be plumbing, might be a plumbing upgrade. But 50% off the top allows you to make sure you have enough to cover your month-to-month expenses, year-to-year expenses, but also your CapEx expenses, because systems do die out in a long-term ownership on a building. So literally you could pay 35% in concept. You pay 35% a month or a 35% on average over a year out in monthly expenses, and you reserve the 15% so that you can pay for those CapEx improvements as CapEx or structural things go wrong with the building and you want to fix those. An HVAC unit goes out. Those would be your CapEx. That leaves you 50% for mortgages and net income. Now, if you're trying to do a cap rate, you could say that you just take 50% off the top and that gives you your cap rate. But I rarely do it that simply, but you can absolutely. When I went to buy my first multi-unit, this was truly 20 years ago, I used this rule of thumb. And the reason why I used this rule of thumb was because I wanted to compare several buildings very quickly off of the MLS. And one of the things I discovered even 20 plus years ago was that all the numbers weren't the same. Some listings for the buildings included things like gardening expenses, included things like CapEx improvements or anticipated improvements. Some were listed with that. Some of the buildings were not listed with those expenses. Some of the buildings were only listed with property tax and insurance, and then they offered what they perceived was the net income on the building. It made it very hard for me to compare cap rate to cap rate, even on the same MLS listing that I would receive if the expenses were listed in such a variable manner. So I retreated to, in being able to look at these buildings, to using a generic rule of thumb, 35% for expenses with the anticipation of potentially reserving 15% for capital improvements. Now, I didn't stop there, but it's a good enough rule of thumb to be able to start. What I've actually seen and what I did end up finally fine tuning to was I needed to consider the age of the building, because net income in a building is distinctly affected by the age of the building. If it is a brand new building, generally people will tell you it's going to be 35% expenses or less, because a brand new building shouldn't have a lot of the unanticipated maintenance expenses, such as a broken garbage disposal or a leaking faucet. But I have noticed that a new building, in the first year of a new building, does have unanticipated expenses, things like a dishwasher that has not been hooked up correctly, leaking and cracking your tile inside of the kitchen. Yes, that's an actual example. I have actually had that happen. Or you will have a dryer that is not working correctly and therefore needs to be replaced and sometimes isn't covered by warranty because you have your contractor and your provider arguing with each other as to which one broke it. So a new building within the first year will have unanticipated expenses because there are things that will go wrong having to do with the new installs. So I would anticipate that. Another thing I would consider is that an existing building, maybe not with a high level of deferred maintenance, but has some maintenance to it. It is no longer a new building. You no longer have a brand new dryer and a brand new washer and a brand new refrigerator and brand new tile and a brand new faucet. You now have maybe anywhere from 5 to 15 years worth of wear and tear on those items, maybe 20 years worth of wear and tear. You have what's called, I would call an existing building. And at that point, I'm clearly going to use my 35% plus some reserves for CapEx expenses, because the useful life of a carpet can be anywhere from 7 years, according to Los Angeles. A useful life of a carpet is 7 years, or 10 years, or 15 years, depending upon how that particular unit has been treated. So an existing building, you will have rotations of expenses going through, even if it was new 20 years ago. Now, that existing building will assume there's been some level of consistent upkeep. I have found on an existing building, if I'm lucky, my general expenses, not including property management, because that's how I calculate it, not including property management, will be 38 to 42%. Somewhere, so I generally think of about being 35 to about 42% is what I will find on an existing building. But if I have a deferred maintenance building, if this building is more than 25 years old, has not been kept up to standard, and often if it's over 25 years old, it will start to not be kept up to standard. So you will have a building that is 40 years old, 50 years old, that has not been kept up to a maybe more clean standard or a desire to have it continue to feel like a new building or a clean building, you get a deferred maintenance building, which, by the way, I often have preferred to purchase deferred maintenance buildings, so I'm not putting them down. I see them as an opportunity. A deferred maintenance building will almost always have close to 50% worth of expenses, if not 55%, because your CapEx breakage is rolled into your monthly expenses. So what I mean by that is you're spending your monthly expenses. You've got your gardener, you've got your electricity for your common space, you have your general maintenance fees, sometimes make ready fees, garbage pickup, pest control, property tax, and insurance. You have all of those fees. That alone will be 35% to 40 to 42%. But now you have a broken HVAC system rolled into your monthly expenses. You have a gate that has now broken and will no longer open to let cars in and out. You now have a CapEx expense that has been rolled into looks like a monthly expense. So you will clearly, in my experience in owning buildings, a deferred maintenance building will generally cost me at least 50% in my expenses on this sort of yearly basis because I'm making CapEx improvements as I go along. Now, my preference when I buy a deferred maintenance building for me, now that I'm an older investor, is to fix a lot of the deferred maintenance when I first purchase a building. And I'm not talking about fixing it because I'm rehabbing the building, I'm planning to sell it. I'm talking about fixing the deferred maintenance on the building because I don't want to deal with it. I don't want, my favorite example is, why would I send in a contractor at $60 an hour, maybe $40 an hour, it used to be 40 when I was younger, maybe it's $60 an hour now. Why would I send in a contractor at $60 an hour or even a handyman at 25 to fix a faucet that is leaking that will cost me $2 to $3 in materials to fix what's wrong with the faucet? I don't want to fix the faucet. I want to replace the faucet, because when I replace the faucet, that means that faucet at least is closer to a new building standard and closer to letting me get to the lower expense ratio of 35% that I would find on a new or new plus building. That's my preference. And if I do that in multiple units or as units come empty as quickly as I can, then I find that I have pulled out my unanticipated CapEx expenses and have made them intentional. I will even intentionally create a maintenance schedule for my buildings that will have me replacing systems like HVAC, like rugs, like gates. Well, rugs really aren't capital expenses, but HVAC and gates and roof repairs into my maintenance schedule so that I can pre-plan when I'm rolling out those CapEx fixes. All right, so I simply wanted to share with you my rule of thumb. I was taught, again, it was 35 years ago that I was taught this, 20 plus years ago, I was taught this rule of thumb, but I still find it useful today. I've been able to fine tune it based on my reality of owning buildings and having worked with my clients and doing expense ratios on their existing buildings. It allows me very quickly to look at a building I am considering purchasing, and rather than digging into the exact expenses that are associated with that building, I can start to compare across multiple buildings what I anticipate that building is going to cost me when I own it and I'm doing my actual maintenances on the building. If it is a deferred maintenance, I will go to my minimum 50% ratio. If it is a brand new building, then I will assume that it is a possibility it will hit a 35% expense ratio. And I will not necessarily have to reserve that extra 15% for capital expenditures. This is Christina Suter with the Real Estate Breakthrough Show. I hope I have taught you something that is useful to you, both new investors and existing investors. Tune in next week for another EDU.